Well, hi, Willow Creek. My name's Steve Cuss. I'm the author of Managing Leadership Anxiety, Yours and Theirs. I consider Dave and Rachel Dummett to be dear friends. I've known them for over a decade, and I love your pastors and love your staff. I've had the incredible privilege of working with your staff because I'm a pastor myself, but one of my specialties is helping people notice, name, and diffuse anxiety. First, always yours and then theirs. Oftentimes it's tempting to see anxiety in other people first, but we always pay attention to what's going on in us, and then we try to help other people. Willow Creek is in this incredible series, Let's Talk About It. Just that phrase, I love that, because anxiety wants to isolate us, and just the simple idea that we get it out in the open. We talk about it as a church, we talk about it in our sermons, but of course, we also get into our midweek community and we get it out into the open and have a conversation. What I'll be doing over the next 3 weeks is just detangling anxiety, taking a look at the different forms of anxiety and helping us understand the unique characteristics of each kind of anxiety. The simple fact is, anxiety is one word that covers really broad territory. Those of you who are football lovers, the way I think about it is each type of anxiety has its own playbook. So today we will be talking about two types of anxiety, but what I'd like to briefly do is just mention the various ones we're going to cover in the 3 weeks. We will talk about acute anxiety, chronic anxiety. We're going to talk about trauma. We're going to talk about depression and the kinds of anxiety that require mental health medications. We'll even be touching on suicide on that one. And then we'll also be talking about grief. So, as you can hear, we are not talking about anxiety, we're talking about anxieties. And if we can detangle them and understand each of them having their own playbook, each of them operating, if you will, by their own set of rules, that can help you both make sense of what you might be carrying or what might be carrying you, but also help you maybe help your loved ones, the family and friends in your life that are carrying things. So, just in brief, next week, we'll be really getting into trauma and depression. And then in the third week, we'll be really getting into grief. What I want to do today is talk about anxieties that are based on things that are real, things that are true. So, for example, grief. Grief is a loss that happened to you, and that's real and true. Trauma. Trauma is an event that actually happened to you in your past, and it's real and true. These are two different types of anxieties. Acute anxiety is a type of anxiety, and it's that short-term anxiety that you feel anytime you think you might be in danger. So if you're ever driving on the interstate and you have to swerve your brakes to get to safety, that's because your body is telling you you are in danger. If you're ever out jogging in the countryside and maybe you see a snake, and, there's two kinds of people in the world. There's people who love Jesus, and then there's people who love snakes, right? And so maybe you see a snake and your body reacts. Or even acute anxiety can happen if you ever lose your child on a playground. That can feel like an immediate life and death. That's also an anxiety that's based on something that's true. Now, we'll dig more into trauma next week. We'll dig more into grief in week 3. The one anxiety I want to focus on today is called chronic anxiety. And chronic anxiety is fascinating because it has its own playbook. It's not based on something true. It's not based on something real. It's based on something false and perceived. So, for example, in my life, I get chronically anxious if I don't know the answer to a question. Anytime I'm in a meeting and somebody asks somebody a question, if I don't know the answer, I get filled with this thing, which is clinically called chronic anxiety. Put me in a room where I've disappointed somebody or let somebody down. I'm a chronic people pleaser, and when I don't please people, I get chronically anxious. For some of you, it might be connected to perfectionism, right? Those of you who are perfectionists, you know who you are. You believe the lie that you must get it perfectly right every time, the first time you've ever done something. Or those of you who struggle with control, we colloquially call you control freaks, right? Maybe you go into a meeting and you have 6 scenarios laid out for yourself, but somebody brings up a scenario you haven't thought about and you get defensive or combative. Not because they asked or said something wrong, but because you are caught off guard. You must always be in control to be okay. These are some of the sources of chronic anxiety, and this is where we're going to spend our time today. Because a lot of people may think about themselves and say, I'm not really an anxious person. And that's because when you think of the word anxiety, you think of worry and fear. Or maybe you think of mental health medication. That category we'll cover next week with depression. But actually, chronic anxiety, every human has it, in the workplace and the home place. And what it looks like is reactivity. Chronic anxiety does not look like worry and fear. Chronic anxiety looks like reactivity. So the question you can ask yourself is, what kinds of situations make me reactive? Actually, it was just last year I was flying home from O'Hare Airport. Sorry, Chicagoans, I consider O'Hare Airport the place where Satan himself lives. It's a terrible place. And there I was at O'Hare, and they'd canceled flights, and I ended up most of the night. And the next morning I got on my plane very early. I land home in Denver, which is where I live now. The seatbelt sign went off, and the family behind me bolted up the aisle. They jumped their turn. Can you believe that? They actually skipped the line. Now, one of the ways you can discover your reactivity or your chronic anxiety, or what we're saying is something you think you need that you don't really need. One of the ways you can discover that is look at your core values, what really matters to you. And when somebody violates one of your core values, you get flooded with reactivity. One of my core values is courtesy. I believe everyone should wait their turn. And so the teenage girl bolted up the aisle. I wasn't able to stop her. By the way, I'm not proud of this, but then I stuck my arm in the aisle and actually blocked the rest of the family from going up the aisle. I turned around, I addressed the family, and I said, hey, we're all trying to get off the plane. Let's just wait our turn. The family invited me to, how do we say it in church, have a relationship with my mother that I would never have. They told me to go to a terrible place, and they busted up the aisle. What was going on in that moment? Well, first of all, I was filled with reactivity because I was chronically anxious. I did not get what I believed I needed in the moment, which is for them to be courteous. What makes you reactive? Think about your precious relationships with your family, your friends, and your workplace, and the kinds of behaviors from others that cause reactivity in yourself. Here's the fascinating thing about chronic anxiety. Out of all the anxieties we're talking about, it's the only one that's contagious because it's generated by assumptions and false expectations. I assume that everyone should wait their turn. I falsely expect that this family should wait their turn. And when that doesn't happen, I get filled with reactivity. Now, one of the ways you can notice reactivity is sometimes when you're filled with reactivity, you get bigger. That's what I did on the plane. I made myself bigger. I stuck my arm in the aisle. I took over. That's because in the moment, my brain got infected with reactivity. I was no longer able to see what was really going on. This is the other fascinating thing about chronic anxiety and reactivity. It puts you in a false reality. It infects your brain. It kind of makes you drunk in the moment, if you will. Maybe you've had a fight with a spouse, or maybe you find yourself in a difficult pattern with a child or somebody at work. What's going on there is your reactivity is taking over and you've lost sense of reality. Rather than connecting to that person, you're now just more interested in winning an argument or proving your point. You're no longer listening to learn. You're now listening to defend, or listening to hijack, or listening to fix. Those are all evidences that when you're filled with reactivity, you get bigger. Sometimes when we're filled with reactivity, we get smaller. We become like a turtle in our shell. Rather than interrupting and getting aggressive and taking over, we go completely the other way. We suddenly don't feel safe to be fully ourselves. We shrink ourselves down. We become maybe like a turtle in our shell. Maybe in a meeting, you hope that no one calls on you, for example, or if somebody does call on you, you make sure to not tell them what you really think because you don't feel safe anymore. And so you end up having your own meeting after the meeting with people you do feel safe with. That can be a way of getting smaller. Sometimes getting smaller can look like charming your way out of a situation. We've seen this in the Me Too movement, haven't we? When these aggressive men are dominating these women and some of them laugh and giggle, and the man doesn't understand that she's made herself smaller. She's just trying to get out. She's just trying to survive. It's fascinating, isn't it? Reactivity. You can see how it's contagious. Now, obviously, I'm a white man. Some truths are self-evident, and you won't find a whiter person than Steve. I'm so white, I'm almost translucent. But as I've worked with people of color and listened to your journeys, one of the things that's fascinating for you is oftentimes you will walk into a room and you will notice, for example, that maybe you're the only one of your kind in a room. Let's say that you are, for example, a black woman, and you walk into a staff meeting where it's all white men. Oh my goodness, your radar is up and you are working so hard, making yourself bigger and smaller, managing that reactivity so you can stay connected. It's extra difficult to be human-sized where you're the only person of your kind in a room. So today's focus is really chronic anxiety. The goal is detangling this word anxiety into its parts. As we dive in next week, getting into different kinds of anxiety, where I want to end with chronic anxiety is a couple of invitations. Number one, what might be an assumption that you hold about yourself that may not be true? For example, a perfectionist or somebody who must be in control, or in my case, a chronic people pleaser. When I think about that question, I think to myself, I need everyone in my life to like me for me to be okay. But that's not true. I can thrive as a human because of what Jesus has done. I can actually be set free from this false need. So that's question number one. What's an assumption I have about myself that's unattainable or not true? The second question, what's an expectation that somebody might be putting on me that I'll never reach? That's how chronic anxiety becomes contagious. Somebody puts their expectation on you, and it infects your assumption about yourself. And also homework this week, because one of the great challenges as we talk about anxiety is learning to notice it in the moment. So some homework you might consider: noticing reactivity in any group of people, but particularly noticing it in yourself. As you walk into a room, is there anybody who's the only one of their kind in a room? That person's probably working extra hard to stay human-sized. But you can also be saying, well, who's getting bigger right now? Who's getting smaller right now? And most importantly, am I catching anxiety? And am I generating and spreading anxiety? So, acute anxiety versus chronic anxiety. Acute anxiety is in the moment, it's based on a real threat, and it feels like life and death. Chronic anxiety, we're always carrying it, and it's not based on something real, it's based on a perceived need. But your body cannot tell the difference between the two until you train it. So pay attention to reactivity this week, and your final invitation is when you notice that you're filled with reactivity, all you have to do is get off the anxiety treadmill. It's not leading you anywhere. You can keep worrying your way to peace, but it's not going to get you anywhere. Get off the anxiety treadmill and take a breath and pause and do what the authors of Scripture remind us to do. Remember the Lord. It only takes 20 or 30 seconds, and then maybe you can give your activity to God, relax into the presence of God, and be human-sized and manage your anxiety. All right, that's week one. I look forward to seeing you next week.